But of course, we can suspend our disbelief in God and ask questions about what difference would it make to morality if there were a God. So let's again then ask, why would one think that these acts that I mentioned, that I'm sure we all think and I think are morally wrong, would not be morally wrong if there were a God? And I'm going to mention 3 claims that people might make in defense of this. So the first claim is that the very concepts I'm using, the expressions right or wrong, even good or bad, would be meaningless if there were no God. They only have meaning in a universe with God because what they really mean, good and something we're obliged to do, mean right, that God wills them. And conversely, that something is wrong or bad, we ought not to do it, means that God wills that they not exist or that they not be done. So we have a meaning to the words through God's will and God's commands. This is a famous position, but also one that has been famously refuted right in the early stages of Western philosophy in Plato's Euthyphro, where essentially the argument was, so what about these things that I've talked about, say? Obviously Plato wasn't talking about those things, but what about these things? Are they only wrong because God says they are wrong? Or does God say does God condemn them, does God command that we not do them because they are wrong? And I think that's very puzzling for the person who defends the view that there is no meaning to right or wrong without the existence of God. Because if you say that they're only wrong because God wills them, or wills the good, condemns the bad, then you're essentially saying that God could have willed the opposite. God could have willed that we drop bombs on villages consisting entirely of civilians. God could have willed that we hack off the limbs of children in order to carry out our civil war in the Congo or in Darfur. And that would have been the right thing to do if God had willed it. And you can't say God wouldn't have willed it because it would have been wrong, because on this conception there is no meaning to it being wrong except that God wills it. So that doesn't seem a very plausible position to take. We really have to take the view that these things would have been wrong, that God, if you like, if you believe in God, condemned them because they were wrong of their nature, of their intrinsic nature. But then you have to admit that there is a meaning to the concept, at least, of right and wrong, independent of God's command. God doesn't give that term meaning, it has meaning prior to him. So the first claim, I think, does not survive that argument. The second claim, sometimes made, is we can't know what is right or wrong without God's revelation to guide us. So yes, the terms have meaning, but we would be lost. We would be at sea, not able to separate right from wrong. Well, if there were a God, and if he had revealed his will about what is right or wrong in clear and indisputable language that we could all accept, then perhaps you could run this line. Then perhaps you could say, God did reveal to us what is right or wrong. But he did not do that. It's quite extraordinary how often religious people refer to some sacred text as if it were the source of all moral knowledge, and then ignore half, the inconvenient half, of course, of what it actually says. And we have plenty of examples of that in the Christian world today, including in this country. For we're living in a society in which most people, anyway, say that they are Christian. And yet, they ignore the repeated insistence of Jesus in the Gospels that everyone, and especially the rich, should give to the poor. You remember that bit of it? You remember when he told the rich man, sell all your possessions and give them to the poor? In case you didn't get the message, he went on to say, it's as hard for a rich man to go to heaven as a camel to go through the eye of a needle. That sounds like it's not a good policy to remain rich if you want to go to heaven, doesn't it? Yet there's lots of rich Christians still in this country. That's a bit of the gospel that they don't really seem to want to follow. And there's lots of other injunctions, for example, many of them in the same course. He urged those who give feasts to invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, and the blind. Most of you probably had a feast last Thursday. Hands up, those who invited the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind. Don't see a lot of hands. I see one or two hands. Very good. Congratulations. That's excellent. That's nice to see. But there's about 800 people in this room, and I saw a dozen or so hands maybe. So I think that we are not actually getting our guidance. People, Christians generally, do not follow. They choose selectively which bits of the Bible they want to follow. Consider what Jesus is reported to have said about divorce. Divorce, he said, either is just wrong altogether, depending which bit of the Gospels you read, or it's only permitted on the grounds of adultery. There's not many Christians, there are some, but there's not many Christians who adhere to that. Even fewer adhere to the idea that to marry a divorced woman is itself to commit adultery. Don't know a lot of Christians who've refused to marry a divorced woman. Not a divorced man, apparently, by the way. Not too sure exactly what the basis of that distinction is. On the other hand, Christians in this country seem to think that they have a lot of guidance from God in Christianity about views about abortion, about the use of obtaining stem cells from embryos, about homosexuality. There's no clear guidance in the Gospels anyway, in the New Testament, about that. People may say, well, it's not just the New Testament, we go to the Old Testament as well. But once you go to the Old Testament, you find a lot of amazing things that God is supposed to have said and commanded, and your job of working out which ones you want to follow is more difficult than ever. For example, God explicitly advocates genocide in the Old Testament. Not passages probably very often read in church, but look at Numbers 31, where God commands the Israelites to wreak his vengeance on the Midianites. And when they go there and destroy their villages and kill their cattle and slaughter the men, they bring back to Moses the women and the children. And Moses is angry. Moses said, "Why have you spared the women and the children? Go and kill them. Go and kill all the women who have known men by lying with them, and kill all the boys. But the girls who haven't known men, keep them for yourselves." Is that where you want to take your moral guidance from? I don't think so. So the scriptures that we have are not guidance to moral thinking. If we want to use them, we have to use our own judgment. We have to sort out for ourselves what's right and wrong. And that's what we're doing anyway, whether we take the scriptures as a sacred text or just take them as an interesting work of literature to discuss and think about. 2 minutes? Thank you. Okay. So let me move to the third claim. The third claim is that even though the terms right and wrong make sense, and even though we can find out what is right and wrong, nevertheless, people won't do it. This is perhaps what Ivan actually had in mind in the Karamazov brothers, because one thing he actually does say, this is a quote, "If there is no immortality, there is no virtue." Now, I admit it would be nice to believe that all the virtuous are going to be rewarded in an afterlife and all the wicked are going to be punished in an afterlife. And it would be even better, of course, if people believed that and acted in their long-term self-interest so that they didn't do things that they believed to be wrong because of this concern about punishment. But it actually doesn't seem to work. It's quite an interesting sociological fact. Of course, I think it's difficult to believe in the first place for reasons that I've spelled out, but it doesn't really seem to work. That is, when we compare more Christian countries with less Christian countries, like this one, for example, with European countries that have a lower level of religious belief and observance, we find that many of the things that Christians condemn are actually more common here. Murder is more common in this country. We have a higher prison rate. And incidentally, some statistics I saw, a little bit dated, suggested that the number of atheists in prison was less than 1%, whereas of the prison population, whereas in the population as a whole, it's regarded as being perhaps 5, 8, 10%, considerably disproportionately small number of atheists in prison. Maybe they're just clever and don't get caught, of course. But let's go on. Abortion rates, teenage pregnancy rates, they're also higher in this country. Juvenile, we also don't look after despite the injunctions I talked about, we don't look after the poor as well in this country as we do in Europe. We have higher rates of poverty, and we have less social support for those who are in poverty. And then, of course, we have the mystery of the various religious people, both evangelicals and Catholic priests, who are constantly talking about sin, constantly emphasizing sexual sins in particular, and are constantly committing them. Well, it's puzzling, isn't it, that if they believe in punishment in the afterlife, this doesn't seem to help them to control their urges, which we all have and which are sometimes difficult to control, but it doesn't seem to be successful in helping them to urge it. So I would say that none of these grounds, just sort of one more point, none of these grounds really would help us to believe in a morality without God.